Yeah,
Get
yeah.
started. Brilliant. Thank you, Ben.
Okay, good. So as Rachel said, we can all look forward to a relaxing time in this session, looking at wet heaths, and me included. It's been one of those mornings you have loads of emails come out, you forms to fill in, and you think, oh God. And then I think, hey, an hour talking about wet heaths, that's really good. So maybe let's have a cup of coffee, and here we go. Wet heath, great habitat. So nice picture of some wet heath there, and those bullet points. I don't usually use bullet points that much, but anyway, here we are. Wet heath, definition, main plant species, and floristic variation within the habitat, the main things that we're going to be looking at today. And on the next page is another introductory page. That one's the one in the Plant Life official style. This is the one that I just did anyway, so I thought I'd put them both in. And that's the wee bit of blurb that I'd written quite a few weeks ago about what this course will be about, with a bit of a silly bit of a poem there. And also mentioning the fact down at the bottom that there'll be a fair bit of overlap between the contents of this session and actually the contents of the one we had last week, which was on bog and wet heath, so wet heath overlap in there, and also one I did a couple of years ago, which we repeated last year, also on bog and wet heath. So 3 sessions, all with quite a lot of overlap. Hence, there'll be some photographs and things that you've seen before if you've been on the other sessions, but there'll also be some different ones. So the next slide is where we can begin this relaxing journey as I'm slurping coffee from time to time. I just find it easier sometimes when I'm drinking a cup of coffee. Yeah. So I said, well, I suppose the first thing we should do, as if it's a real chore, of course it isn't really, to check out the definition of wet heath. And so how to tell it from things like dry heath and bogs, they're about the most similar kinds of habitats. They can both be quite heathy with ericoid dwarf shrubs in them. And so it's wet heath will contain quite a bit of at least one of these 4 species, like collectively in good quantity. You know, it might be just one of them and there'll be a load of it, or it might be all 4 of them, so not that much of each one, but collectively forming a significant amount of vegetation. Cross-leaved heath, deer grass, and purple moorgrass, and bog myrtle. I won't go into the details about exactly how to identify these species, partly because you probably all know that already, and also it'll take more time, and we've got to whiz through this thing in about an hour, which is a bit shorter than some of the earlier sessions we had in the last couple of years. It's good practice for talking a bit faster and sort of trying to get to the point of it. So anyway, those 4 species are important things in wet heath. And it's, you also find them in bogs, and in dry heath, you won't find very much of them, if any. You won't find much of them at all. If there only be, there'll be just be kind of the most tiny, sparse bit here and there. You can get a bit of cross-leaved heath here and there in the dry heath, but only tiniest amounts compared to wet heath. So wet heath versus dry heath is usually quite clear. Wet heath from bog, though, if bogs can share any or all of those 4 species, then that is another consideration. So if we go on to the next page, we can see what we need to look at if we're wanting to separate wet heath from bog. First species that comes to mind there is hair's-tail cotton grass, big tusky thing. Looks a little bit like deer grass, and it's big and tusky, and there's lots of wiry things, but in this case their wiry things are leaves, whereas in the deer grass there's stems with tiny little brownish flowers at the tips. Hair's-tail cotton grass flowers come out very early in the year, those funny greyish catkin-like things, and then they turn in later in, like this time of year now, into these single white cottony heads, very, very distinctive. So that's about our single best indicator for bog. You hardly get any hair's-tail cotton grass in a wet heath. You might here and there get the titchiest little bit, but basically not. It's very much a bog plant. The next slide reminds us how to tell that species from the common cotton grass, which has multiple white heads per stem as opposed to just a single one. Multiple ones on the common cotton grass, and they hang sideways or downwards. Also, the leaves are different. Common cotton grass doesn't form these great big tussocks. It's just got thinner tufts, and the individual leaves are not so thin and wiry. They're a bit wider, like a lot of other sedge leaves, really, with that V-shaped profile and a groove, therefore running up the middle of the leaf until you get a few centimeters back from the tip, and then suddenly the groove ends, and it all from there on it gets kind of filled in like it's a solid triangular section end of the leaf, quite sort of hard and stiff as well, quite solid. Diagnostic feature that of the common cotton grass. And there's another species, broadleaf cotton grass, which is much scarcer and grows in calcareous places. That has something similar, but so much shorter, really, really much shorter, and the leaves are really short, much shorter as well. Common cotton grass is kind of unique in having this solid, thickened triangular section end to the leaves that's quite a few centimeters long, really unbelievably long. So common cotton grass will grow in wet heath as well, and in bogs and a whole load of other wet places. It's got a wider ranging habitat range than hare's tail cotton grass. So you can get bits of common cotton grass in a wet heath. Though it's on the whole a bit more common in bogs than it is in wet heath, definitely more common in bogs. So the next page has a couple of mosses. I know the MPMS doesn't officially do mosses, but if you're wanting to check out, is this wet heath or is it bog, there's a couple of mosses you can bear in mind. These are big, chunky sphagnum species. Sphagnums have that sort of flower-like head at the top. Well, all the side branches in sphagnums, if you look at them, you can differentiate between some that are wide-branched, kind of like big sphagnum, and others that are much more narrowly branched, like the picture on the lower right. You could call them small sphagnums, although any of them can form big patches. But in bogs, you often find one or both of those two species in the big photos there, Sphagnum Papillosum and Sphagnum Mantulanicum. They're big chunky sphagnum species with these, they got big branch leaves. That's what makes the branches look kind of thick and fat. One of them is ochre coloured, Sphagnum Papillosum, and the other one's red. Sphagnum medium stroke Sphagnum divinum. They've been split off from the previous Sphagnum Mantulanicum that kind of lumped things together. The one on the right is red, so it's not just any red sphagnum means it's bog, because the lower right picture is a much more common species of red sphagnum called Sphagnum Capilifolium, and that one you can find in bogs and in wet heaths and a whole load of other sort of damp to wet acid places, and it's really, really common. And it's different from the big red one in that the branch leaves are much more small and narrow, which makes the branches look much thinner. It's a much more fine little thing. So there's things to look for to differentiate between bogs and wet heath, hare's tail cotton grass, and those two big sphagnum species. Next page has got some other species of dwarf shrubs that you can find in wet heath. Firstly, most important one to mention there on the left is heather, because it's extremely common in wet heaths and in bogs and in dry heaths. It's about the most abundant overall, most abundant of all the dwarf shrubs, the ericoid dwarf shrubs in all of those three broad habitats: bogs, wet heaths, and dry heaths. Bell heather is actually mainly a plant of dry heaths. It likes kind of drier ground, but it does grow in some wet heaths as well, quite commonly in some of the drier end, the naturally drier end of wet heaths. And then the other one's Blaeberry or Bilberry, same plant, same different names, and cowberry and crowberry. They can all grow in wet heaths. The Bilberry a little bit more commonly than the other two in wet heaths. The cowberry and the crowberry a little bit more common in dry heaths and in bogs than they are in wet heaths, but they can occur in wet heaths, and they're quite northern as well, on the whole, northern upland species. So there's a range there of different dwarf shrubs that we can find in wet heaths. The next page is a reminder that it's not just the wet heath vegetation. The vegetation type, for the most part, is what's necessary to distinguish wet heaths from bogs. But there's also a thing about peat depth, in that bogs are written about as generally being on peat more than 50 centimeters deep. But we can actually find bog vegetation with a whole load of hare's tail cotton grass or those particular sphagnum mosses on a shallower peat. and then we would still call it bog because it's the right kind of vegetation. However, if you get wet heath vegetation, so you're lacking those hare's tail cotton grass and sphagnum species, particular sphagnums, then so it's wet heath vegetation. But if it's on a peat that's a deeper one, probably means there's been something going on and it's dried out the top of the upper part of the peat, which would probably originally have had bog vegetation, but it's got drier. And in the MPMS, that actually gets pulled into bog as opposed to wet heath, even though it's wet heath vegetation. So on deeper peat goes into bog. The bulk of our wet heath, though, is on shallower peat. So you don't see this quite that often, but that's an example. Usually, where the bog's been dried out by something pretty visually obvious in many cases, like this erosion here, or it could be draining or burning, combination of things. Okay, and the next picture, with a whole lot of arrows messing it up, just to show where there's wet heath and bog in this picture, and also purple moorgrass and Molinia, vegetation dominated by that. This is a kind of vegetation that has quite a lot in common with wet heath. It can share a lot of the species, but the thing is that the purple moorgrass and Molinia is absolutely really strongly dominant in the Molinia mire, strongly dominant at the expense of the other things. So you might get titchy little bits of heather or cross-leaved heath, not very much at all. That's why it stands out in those in this photo here. It's those kind of slightly paler, greener areas, and it's mostly on peaty soils that can vary from shallow peat, in which case the vegetation was probably once wet heath and has come to be dominated by the purple moorgrass because of some combination of grazing out the dwarf shrubs, or burning, which gives Molinia a competitive edge. So some kind of modification there that's led to the Molinia dominated mire. The Molinia mire can also occur on deeper peat, where it would have been derived from a more heathy kind of bog vegetation that again has probably lost its dwarf shrubs for similar reasons, some combination of grazing and burning. So here we see little bits of Molinia mire patched there amongst the more heathy wet heath and blanket bog. The Molinia mire can do particularly well in a wet heath dominated landscape in places where there's just a little bit of kind of flushing in a way, little sort of hollows, slightly deeper peat than the rest of the wet heath. But it varies. It grows across a huge range of habitats. Molinia is really common. But yeah, you want to be on the lookout for Molinia-dominated vegetation because it's a slightly different kind of vegetation than the wet heath and the bog. And Molinia mire on a shallower peat, like an ordinary wet heath depth of peat, will actually go into the MPMS marsh and fen habitat. Whereas if it's on a deeper peat, it goes into bog, MPMS bog. Okay, next picture is some more of the vegetation that actually goes along with that Molinia dominated mire into either NPMS marsh and fen, if it's on shallower peat, or NPMS bog, if it's on a deeper peat. And this has a lot in common with the Molinia dominated greener bits we saw in the last photo, except it looks kind of more shrubby because there's loads of bog myrtle growing in it. You might think, doesn't that make it a wet heath? But it doesn't. In floristic terms, it's actually, and vegetation classification terms, including things like the National Vegetation Classification and so on, it gets lumped in with the Molinia-dominated mires. So we can often call them Molinia myrica mires, these ones where Molinia is co-dominant with myrica. So that kind of vegetation we're looking at there with co-dominant Molinia and myrica, but hardly anything at all, if anything, in the way of heather or cross-leaved heath or deer grass, doesn't go into wet heath. It's a separate kind of vegetation. Right, the next picture is, well, the text is talking about distribution, which is mainly in the Scottish Highlands and the Islands, and it's most common in the West. Galloway is really good for it as well, and Western Ireland, but elsewhere It's not that common, not very extensive. And here's a picture of a big extent of it in the Outer Hebrides, typical Outer Hebridean, Hebridean kind of landscape. In fact, through much of the far west highlands of Scotland and the Hebrides as well, wet heath is about the single most extensive type of semi-natural vegetation, hugely extensive, mostly on gentle slopes like we're seeing here. Sometimes on, we see it on flatter ground, especially where it's mixed in with bogs, and also getting onto some quite steeper slopes. And we'll see some steeper one a bit later on, actually. Okay, next picture is just mucking about there, saying Goodbeat looks at definition and the main species and the distribution. So I happen to have some coffee with me. Cheers, you know, but we can't go quite yet. And I'm sure we will all have a nice day. So this, the title included a closer look at wet heath. So I've got a load of pictures here at some of the first ones that we're going to see from now on are showing some general landscape scale views of wet heath to show different appearances because of different combinations of the species. See that page back near the beginning, it had the cross-leaved heath, the deergrass, the purple moorgrass and the bog myrtle as things that we do get, at least one of those in abundance in the wet heath. Well, there's 4 species there to play around with. You can get different combinations of them. So that makes a big difference as far as the appearance of vegetation is concerned. Here, for example, is some wet heath with consisting mainly of heather and deergrass. It's down in Wales. So it's actually the site with the largest extent of wet heath in the whole of Wales. We do see quite a lot of wet heath that's co-dominated by heather and deergrass, and there are going to be some more pictures of that combination coming up. The next picture is some wet heath. This is not very far from where I live, just up in the hills up the road. Co-dominated here by, you know, I was just about to write it in there, and I thought, hey, let's put it as a question, because I know you like to have a few questions fired at you. So what are these 2 species that this vegetation, this wet heath vegetation is made up of? Give you just a few seconds or a wee while. It's not like you've got to pile in a load of answers.
Oh, if you do have any guesses at all, do feel free to pop them in the chat. It's not a test, I promise, but just a bit of fun if you'd like to add anything in there.
And what more kind of fun can you have than looking at a picture like that and thinking what they are? It's a nice picture anyway. It's a nice sky. And it shows that even some common species kind of look good, you know, right light conditions.
So anybody's going to bite the bullet here. Shall I put us all out of our misery?
Okay, yes, do that and go on to the next page. Heather and purple moorgrass, and of course you all knew that. Yeah, see how different it looks from the heather and deergrass. The deergrass was that little, well, they're quite big actually in a way, tufts, tussocks of, we'll see more pictures of it, which can be quite a goldeny colour as the summer wears on into the autumn. And they're slightly spiky looking because they're very straight. Purple moorgrass, these long leaves have got more breadth to them, and they sort of flop about more. And the purple moorgrass can get very, very tussocky. It so happens it's not that tussocky in here, in this photograph, not yet. So the next picture has back to actually heather and deergrass being particularly common, but there is purple moorgrass mixed in. You can see its tall flowering shoots on the left-hand side have gone paler. And the deergrass, that's slightly more golden tinged stuff there. I've written deergrass, written the name by it. This is some wet heath. The previous photographs that we just had of it were very species poor wet heath, but this is a bit richer. It's got some orchids, some heath spotted orchid among other things going there. And as you get down and look even closer into it, in a lot of places like this, you can find quite a lot of species. Pretty good stuff, really. There's bits of cross-leaved heath in there, although they're pretty tricky to see. But that's just another view of some wet heath in the West Highlands, that one. The next photo has another one in the West Highlands. There's loads of photos I got from the West Highlands, or the West and the North Highlands, because that's just where the most wet heath is, and that's also where I happen to have done an awful lot of survey work in wet heath places, and just thought I'd take some photos of it while I was there. This one here, we got that purple moorgrass again, those long, rather broad leaves. And there is deergrass and heather and bits of cross-leaved heath, quite a nice mix there. Sutherland, the dramatic outline of the hill, Ben Loyal back over in the distance. It's quite a bit taller than some of the other ones we just seen. The previous photo, vegetation wasn't as tall as this one. Okay, the next picture, again in the far north, this is in Caithness. Heather and deergrass, again, the most common species. And because this was taken in the autumn, the deergrass has changed from green kind of about this time of year, but then it doesn't stay green for as long as it actually is more kind of an orangey browny color. In the autumn, it goes this brown, this golden color, makes it more distinctive. But this is an example of some wet heath right up in the far north, where you can get a kind of frosting of lichens of the genus Cladonia, different kinds of Cladonia, Cladonia portentosa, Cladonia uncialis, Cladonia arbuscula, those sorts of species, which imparts a particular sort of visual characteristic to the vegetation. This makes it quite distinctive. You do get a lot of those lichens in dry heaths and in bogs and in some grasslands in those same areas, the far north and the northeast. Sort of going further north and east generally. Kind of, it's a more boreal feature. You get loads of these lichens in places in parts of Scandinavia. So the northeasternmost parts of Britain, there's some, I don't know, just the climate being cooler, and especially further east where it's not quite so intensely wet, it's getting a bit more like parts of Scandinavia, a bit more boreal. Okay, the next picture is again mainly heather and deergrass, but it's in the west. This is on the Isle of Skye, and nothing like as much of those lichens. Can't see any lichens there, but they will be knocking around a small quantity. But what there is a lot of Racemitrium moss, those grey-green sort of hummocky things, Racemitrium laniginosum. As with dry heaths, the further west you go, you tend to get more Racemitrium. Further east you go, this is up in the north, you get more of the Cladonia lichens. Works for dry heaths and wet heaths. That's wet heath in the back there on the left, where we lose the deergrass and it's just rocks and heather for the most part. But the rest of the picture, there's lots of deergrass giving that goldeny brown colour. And so that's wet heath, even though the peat's pretty shallow, not really that wet. See, there's rocks in it. You know, it's a shallow and rather discontinuous cover of peat. It's not the kind of place you'd expect to have loads of sphagnum. Sometimes people think, oh, wet heath's probably going to have sphagnum in it and differ from dry heath because of its sphagnum. Actually, some dry heaths can have sphagnum in them. It's like that little red Sphagnum Capilifolium. And you can find wet heath with no sphagnum. So sphagnum isn't how you tell wet heath from dry heath. It's those species, the deergrass, the cross-leaved heath, the purple moorgrass, and the bog myrtle, some combination of those. And in this case, it's the deergrass. Okay, next picture is again heather and deergrass, both very abundant, with quite a scatter of little whitish-coloured Cladonia lichens in there. Up in Sutherland, not that surprising to find all those lichens. And there's bits of bell heather there, though you can't really see it very clearly unless you magnified it up quite a bit. But that's another example of what is at the naturally drier end of wet heath on a shallow peat with bits of rock sticking out of it. And the next one is quite different, really. wet heath with lots of heather. In fact, it goes into heather-dominated dry heath in the background there. Otherwise, there's a mix of heather and purple moorgrass. You can see the leaves of it coming through, and a whole load of bog myrtle. So that's wet heath. And I flung in a question. Oh, but I've mentioned that this is on a rather deeper peat. You don't tend to get masses of bog myrtle on the most shallow peats. It usually needs a reasonable depth, but still, it doesn't have to be anything like 50 centimeters bog kind of depth to be bog myrtle. And although bog myrtle is called bog myrtle, it's absolutely not just a bog plant. We get it in wet heath and in Molinia myers and in various other bits of flushes and things here and there too. So, oh yeah, I'd mentioned that the bog myrtle, what we're seeing, that's not all bog myrtle. Can you find something that isn't? Obviously, I'm not talking about heather. You know, there's something bog myrtle-ish in its appearance that's not bog myrtle. And what is it? Where is it? And what is it? Just a wee few moments to look at that and think, where is it? And what is it?
We have one suggestion here of eared willow.
Yep. And which means it's time to go on to the next page.
Aha, that led us on very well, didn't it? Hang on a moment.
To say, yep, eared willow indeed.
Not sure who that was because you're anonymous, but well done, yes.
Well done, whoever you are. Unsung hero, because we don't know who you are. Yeah, it's it can get bigger than the bog myrtle. Well, actually, bog myrtle can grow surprisingly tall if it's not very grazed. And eared willow can be held down in its height where it is browsed. So it's not that surprising to find the two about the same size. But the eared willow has that pale look, that pale, slightly glaucous look, a little bit more so than the bog myrtle. And when we get close, you see those wrinkly leaves. So good, well done. Next picture, thinking about different appearances again, is where there's not so much in the way of graminoids. And again, I was just about to write it and I thought, hey, make it into a question and see what people say. So I've written the questions there. What's the habitat type and the main species for each of those two zones, to the left and to the right of the white dashed line. And again, a few moments to ponder on that. So we can probably, no answers, nobody's come up with anything. That's because it's too easy. That's because it's so obvious. Okay, shall we go on to the next picture, which says, as you were all thinking, the one on the left is wet heath. Cross-leaved heath is dominant. There's also quite a bit of purple moorgrass in there, but there's more of the cross-leaved heath, which gives it that really different look. The previous pictures we saw, the dwarf shrubs were mainly heather, and it was like a salt and pepper effect of dark dwarf shrubs and pale graminoids, which is so much the common general appearance of wet heaths. But here we're seeing one of those examples where it's a more kind of uniformly right through it. There's pretty much dominant cross-leaved heath. Gives it a very, very different look. And the one on the right, heather is dominant, and there's very, very little, if any, of the, you can just see a few at the edges, hence of cross-leaved heath there, that basically it's heather strongly dominant, which means it's dry heath, because it hasn't got those enough of those wet heath indicators. Quite a common situation to see in some of these places where, actually, it's in a lot of the lowland wet heath, and lowland and more eastern wet heath, there's it's in those areas that there's a little bit more of a tendency for the cross-leaved heath to be the dominant vascular plant species, but not entirely. Right throughout the range, we never really know what we're going to find in the way of different combinations of those of the cross-leaved heath, deer grass, the purple moor grass, and the bog myrtle, whether we're in north, south, east, or west. Okay, next picture. There's another example, and this is a lowland one here, of wet heath in which there's more cross-leaved heath than there is heather. And there's a lot of purple moor grass in that one as well. In some places, cross-leaved heath can be very abundant and heather much less so, because of grazing, or browsing, I should say, or shrubs, because cross-leaved heath is not anything like as palatable as heather. So some places you go and you think, oh, it's grazing can't be too bad here, maybe because it's very heathy, but actually if it's mostly cross-leaved heath and very little heather, then it could actually be quite heavily grazed. Right, so next picture is something quite different, just to show how we can find wet heath on slopes that are steeper than we might expect, steeper and more stony, in the West Highlands, west of Ross. Thing is, mainly something we find in the Northwest Highlands and the Hebrides, where the climate is so wet and cool that you can be on quite a steep slope, and it's going to stay pretty wet for most of the time. Soils are sort of even quite shallow, peaty soil there, but evapotranspiration rates are low because it's cool and it's always raining. So actually it's not that surprising. And some of these landscapes on slopes of sufficient gradients that we would look at on the map and think, oh, dry heath is the thing for that. Sometimes it's surprising how little dry heath there is in some of these places. There's a bit of bracken at the lower right, and a little titchy bit. I can see some dry heath down among the scree just above the bracken. But no, lots of, and of course on the steep vertical sides of that gully, that's not going to be wet heath, obviously. But yeah, loads of wet heath on ground that is really quite steep and rocky. The next picture, thinking of other kind of habitat situated location context for wet heath on the coast, again on quite rocky ground with a thinnish, discontinuous soil, loads of cross-leaved heath. We're not seeing deer grass or purple moor grass here, but lots and lots of cross-leaved heath. So it is a heath, and it's a wet heath, and it's a coastal one. And sometimes you find coastal species in these examples of this, like the sea plantain, Plantego maritima, or thrift area. You know, it's not that common to find a good lot of wet heath right down by the sea like this, but yeah, it does occur. Okay, next picture. Thinking of other kind of appearances of wet heath. Here's one that's got it's got heather, it's got cross-leaved heath in there. Not that you can see it very clearly. It's got deer grass. You see that goldeny tinge to some of the green, and it's got purple moor grass as well, and shoots of bog myrtle coming up. So it's quite, in a way, sort of typical wet heath, showing a whole range of indicators. There's also a few spikes of some white orchids. We'll see some closer picture of that in a wee while. This heath, though, one thing that is different about it, and you can't tell until you look close, like my being in there, not even close from this photo, is that it's flushed and it's actually quite species rich. And because of the flushing, seems to be slightly base enriched flushing as well. We're going to see some more pictures of that in a wee while too, what the actual species that we find. Anyway, let's have a look at the next picture. Here's another kind of view of wet heath in which dry heath in the distance, and some kind of vegetation in the foreground, which, see how it's quite flat, certainly compared with the slopes just behind. And so it's from the slopes in the distance, we come down from dry heath into a flatter kind of hollow with more graminoid vegetation. Looks like there's some purple moor grass in there, certainly some cross-leaved heath and some heather. And so I put it in as a question. What do you think this habitat type is flatter and more graminoid than the dry heath. Only a few moments to think of this. And
it's feeling a bit quiet, so I'm going to click us along.
So let's go on, because it's not really a question with well, it's just to make us think that how wet heath, and this is wet heath, how though in its general appearance, you know, if I said to you on the previous slide that if I said to you that's bog in front, flat expanse there of this bog with heather, cross-leaved heath and purple moorgrass all common in it. There's some yellow flowers I can see of bog asphodel in there too. That wouldn't be that surprising maybe, and especially as it slopes up at the back into a heath. And you know how so much bog is on ground, on deep peat that's pretty flattish in hollows. We can get bogs on some slopes as well, but a lot of bog is on this wetter, flatter stuff, looking pretty much like that. But wet heath can also occupy these kind of flat or nearly flat hollows, basins, those kind of places. And this is an example of that. And from some distance back, that might not be apparent, whether it's wet heath or bog. Obviously, like a lot of vegetation types, it helps to get in there. You need to get in there to check it out and see which kind it is. Once you dive into this vegetation, as I did when I was there, it was obvious pretty soon that it was wet heath and not bog, because it's got a load of flush indicated there species again, actually in this case, really quite interesting. And so it'd be a good thing to have a look. We got some photos coming up of some of these flush indicator species that some of them indicating base enrichment. So it's quite exciting to find a whole load of extra stuff added in a way to a wet heath. So if we move on to the next picture, which begins with a big B, as it could be for but, or in this case, before seeing those exciting flush species. One thing we better do is take a look at some of the commoner species that we find through wet heaths a bit more generally, because we've had those dwarf shrubs and those common graminoids, purple moorgrass and the day grass and so on, common cotton grass. But some of these other things, I mentioned bog asphodel just then. So a few closer pictures of some of these things. Here's bog asphodel. It's like a little yellow orchid with little flattened spikes of leaves, tufts of leaves, and flower heads that go brown later on, and they persist well through the winter. So you can always tell it. Very distinctive little plant found in bogs and wet heaths. It's called bog asphodel, but as a lot of these things are named, don't take it literally. It's just as common in wet heaths and various flushes. So that's an easy one, very common one. Another picture on the next picture has three heath spotted orchids, probably about the commonest species of orchid in wet heaths, and with a bit of bog myrtle growing behind it and to the right in that photo. Tormentil, such a common plant in a whole range of acid habitats, grasslands, heaths, woods. Not surprising to find that tormentil is very common in a lot of our wet heaths as well. Easy to tell with those four-petaled flowers and leaves with three leaflets and stipules at the base of leaf stalks. Lousewort, the easy one as well. Funny thing, a very short, quite short plant, branched at the base with those leaves all divided up in a complex kind of way and those relatively large pink flowers. That's quite common, sparse, but very common on damp, peaty soils. Wet heath's one of its main habitats. Next slide has got the, we're talking about sundews. By far the commonest kind of sundews, these little insectivorous plants, is the round-leaved sundew, unmistakable. Leaves with those long red hair things, and the leaves are round. There's a spike of a little group of white flowers that come up in the summer, but the leaves are about the most distinctive thing. And there are a couple of other species, sundew, that are less common, whose leaves are longer and relatively narrow. I've mentioned those down at the bottom. We can get them all in wet heath really, but yeah, by far the commonest one is the round leaf that we're looking at there. And it grows in various other habitats as well, flushes, occasionally in bogs too. You find it quite a bit in bogs, wetter bogs. So the next slide is a couple of very common sedges that we can find in wet heath. Common sedge on the left, star sedge on the right. They're both about the commonest in damp, wet, acid places. Very distinct, especially the star sedge with those flowers. Nothing else quite really. Well, there are other things quite like it, but nothing else really like it. Both very, very common. I've put identification details down there, so I'll not go through them all, otherwise we'll take ages. So there's a couple of some of our commonest kinds of sedges that we can find in wet heath, and of course not just in wet heath, they grow in other kinds of wet, damp to wet acid habitats too. The next slide is now we can have a look at some flush species, as if they're such exciting things. And that photo on the left, I know that doesn't really look terribly exciting, does it? Just looking out down at some peaty ground with some little sedge tufts, but actually they're nice. This is the carnation sedge, Carex panacea. They're a lovely carnation-y leaf colour, aren't they? That's where it gets its name, I guess. Pale glaucous colour on both sides of the leaves, and the way they spread out, and you get them in threes as you look straight down on them, and those flower spikes with a rather untidy arrangement of big, almost oversized looking fruits on them. So carnation sedge does like a rather flushed sort of situation. Where we find it in wet heath is mostly where there's some flushing. Actually, we can also find it in places that have been quite trampled by big herbivores, especially by sheep and cattle, around the edges of unenclosed upland areas as you're coming up towards where it goes into fields. And in some of those places, it's a bit less flush, but the trampling has opened up the ground a bit and given the carnation sedge a bit of a competitive edge. But otherwise, it tends to be a pretty good indicator of some flushing, sufficiently good that we tend not to find the carnation sedge in bogs, even though it's such a hugely common species of ground from acid to fairly basic damp places. You might think bogs would be good habitat for it, but they're not. Okay, the next one, this is a species that looks a bit like carnation sedge. It's glaucous sedge, Carex flacca. It's a bit bigger in some ways, has some more spikelets. I won't go into all the details. It's a bit more concentrated on less acid soils, a bit more neutral to basic. Okay, the next one. So we get that in flushed wet heaths. Yeah. And here's one that's a good one to know for flushed wet heath or any kind of flushed places where the flushing brings in a bit of base enrichment, the flea sedge. The leaves are nothing much at all. They're just so thin and wiry, you could mistake them for all sorts of things. And you hardly ever see them. They're not much to see. You wouldn't even notice them probably. But then the flowers, the tips of the stems are very distinct. The whole thing is very narrow and it points upwards when it first comes out. But then those fruits kind of go like that and bend gradually down, out and down, and they jump off the stem. When you can, when they're ripe, if you sort of touch them coming up from the stem like that, and suddenly they jump off like fleas. It's quite fun. So it's a very good indicator of base enriched flushing. Next slide. This is actually quite a comparatively rare species, but I think it's probably overlooked because an awful lot of the Carex vaginata, the sheath sedge, an awful lot of it is out there without any flower heads on and may go unnoticed. And the leaves tend to be a way that you can pick it up because they're funny kind of yellowy, dull yellowy green. It's quite a nice colour, and they maintain a fair width right or almost to the end, and then it's quite shortly tapered at the end. Flushed wet heaths are one of its habitats, and damp flushed grasslands as well, and base enriched flushes, actual sedge flushes too. So something to look out for if you're up in the hills, mainly in the highlands. So nice kind of sedge. The next picture has another kind of sedge, although it's not in the genus Carex. This is Schenus, the black bog rush, and it's very much through most of Britain and Ireland. It's very much a plant of places where there's base-rich flushing. So it could be sedge mires, it could be sort of damp calcareous grassland in the northwest and where there's water coming down, and flushed, enriched wet heaths. Actually, in the far west of Ireland, it's also in bogs, actually in acid bogs. And you get it in bogs in a few places in the extreme west of Scotland as well. But usually if you're in a bog and you see some Schenus, and you're thinking, hey, there's Schenus in a bog. When you get close up in there, you find there's actually a little tract of flushing coming through. It's actually kind of flushed wet heath. So there's a picture of that habitat on the left and the plant on the right. It's quite a distinctive plant with those dark blobby heads. And the next page has got some very easily recognizable plants. That's butterworts. Well, at least the common butterwort is, with those unmistakable biggish yellowy green sticky leaves and flowers like violets. Pale butterwort can also be found in flushed wet heaths with a bit of base enrichment. It's a rather more restricted distribution, mainly west and southern. And the leaves are much, much smaller and duller, and the flowers are paler. So butterworts, flushed wet heaths, it can be a good habitat for both butterworts. Next one is the bog pimpernel, Anagallis tenella. Flowers usually pale pink, but they can be quite white, and little creeping shoots of opposite pairs of roundish leaves, very small. And the next one, again, shooting through these so we don't, to try and guard against overshooting the hour mark for this presentation. Butterfly orchids, the lesser butterfly orchid is more of a kind of wet heath plant. Greater butterfly orchid can be in there as well, but tends to be maybe a bit more in damp grasslands. Those details of the flowers will separate them. So that's the thing that we saw earlier on. There are two or three spikes of it in a more distant view of some wet heath. And the next picture, pretty rare, the marsh gentian. See, there can be some special things in wet heaths. People often look at landscapes, especially these days, you find people showing big upland pictures of big upland landscapes of grassland or things like wet heath, grassy wet heath. Saying, oh, devastated landscape because it's got no trees on it. But actually, it's surprising what interest you can find in some of these places. And wet heath as a whole is totally not a poor habitat. And so, yeah, down south, you can find, in some places, you can find this beautiful rare gentian growing in it. Here's some, next picture is some mosses. Again, I know these aren't like strictly identification for wet heath species, but I just thought I'd put them in to show, among other things, how wet heath, especially where it's got a bit of flushing, can be made more attractive by these plants. Different growth forms there, these different species of Sphagnum denticulatum, Butilio, like a bottle brush, Campylopus atrovarians, very dark. And if you're in the Hebrides, then you might find Campylopus shorii, which is an amazing thing. I wrote a poem about this some years ago. I'll read it out. Some are shiny, others dull. I found a moss on the Isle of Mull, big and bold, beautiful gold, growing on a hill where the wind blows cold and the rain comes lashing down. Winter colours, drab and brown, but not that moss, never goes duller, never looks sad, keeps its colour. That's it, because it's such a nice golden, shiny, golden green. Campylopus shorii, quite exciting find, and it's very restricted oceanic distribution. Okay, on to the next picture, and here we have one of these southern species that we can find. We have the marsh gentian, but that's really rare, but much more common down south. We've got western gorse here growing in some wet heath, just as it can also grow in dry heath, too, equally common in both. And on the next page, we've got some more, in fact, a whole load more of the western gorse. It's not so obvious, of course, because it's not in flower in this picture, but nevertheless, there it is. And we see a whole load of western gorse like that, pretty much the commonest species. And we could think, oh, is that a wet heath or is it dry heath? Could be either. then seeing how much cross-leaved heath there is, and there's a lot of the leaves of purple moorgrass sticking out, the combination of those two both together, that's got to be a wet heath rather than a dry heath. So another completely different appearance of wet heath there. Next picture is how to separate the different species of gorse, because see the western gorse in those last two photos, well, dwarf gorse, which has a much more restricted, more southern distribution, can also occur in dry heaths and in wet heaths and do the same kind of thing. So that tells us how to separate them all. Obviously, I haven't got enough time to go through all the details of those separations for identification, because we've got to move on to the next page, which shows a couple of grasses. One is very localized in southwestern, that's the one on the left, the bristlebent, which can grow in dry heaths and in wet heaths, and it actually does very well where it's been burned, funnily enough, but not always where it's been burned. And it's got very thin, wiry leaves and tufts, making it look a bit like the much more common wavy hair grass that's in those other two photos there. Flower head's very different, narrower, but these are grasses that you can find equally in wet heath and dry heath. And on in the next picture, we're going, because that bristlebent is down in the southwest, going north again, towards the more montane end of things. Here's dwarf juniper. Dwarf juniper can be very scattered in quite decent amounts in some of our far northwestern wet heaths, or especially the slightly drier wet heaths on thin peats over stony ground, as in this picture here over on the Ben A Nature Reserve in Wester Ross. And another one on the next slide is the bearberry coming up, Arctostaphylos uva. Again, the wet heaths that are on slightly thinner soils, because it also grows in dry heaths and in rocky places. So it kind of, on the whole, likes it drier, but it is tolerant of a certain amount of wetness, as we find at the drier end of wet heaths. It likes a bit of space, does the bearberry. So, because it's not a very good competitor with some of the other plants. By the way, I should have said the dwarf juniper on the previous page. That's one of the things that's good. It's good. One of the reasons why it's good to see that is because it tends to indicate there probably hasn't been much burning or any burning for quite a long time. So that's always a good sign. Okay, and the next picture is more definitely montane. This is up in the hills near Glencoe. It looks a bit like grassland, but it's actually got loads of deer grass. That's the main species in there that's telling us it's wet heath. And it's grading out into slightly paler patches where mat grass, Narda stricta, is dominant. So the mat grass dominance is a kind of montane snowbed grassland, and the deer grass dominance is a montane wet heath. There's you need to scrabble about in amongst there to differentiate between the two on the whole, because they intergrade. The next photo has some more montane wet heath. This is one place I was in last year up in Perthshire, where again lots of deer grass. You can see that a bit more obvious there, and some very short heather in there. There's quite a montane flora scattered through it, including bits of quite a rare species of club moss. In fact, the next page again, the next page has some closer pictures of some of the things we can find. That rare club moss, Lycopodium lagopus, quite an exciting find. And bog bilberry can get into these montane wet heaths as well. And crowberry of the montane kind, the subspecies Hermaphroditum. So it's good to find wet heath. This is up at its most montane end. It's not hugely common in the montane zone, but yeah, it does get up there. And the next picture, which is also quite montane. See how that vegetation on the left, somebody might say, oh, it looks really boring, it looks quite ordinary. But it doesn't. There's different textures and colours in there, and you can see there's a load of deer grass in the foreground especially. And it's not only, well, that tells us it's wet heath. So even if we haven't got much in the way of dwarf shrubs, dominance of deer grass and absence of bog indicators, it comes into the wet heath category, and it's quite flushed here with a bit of base enrichment, including these species, the Alpine meadow rue and the sheath sedge and the Alpine salwort. Sorry, I haven't got pictures of the flowers of the Alpine salwort or the Alpine meadow rue. But the Alpine meadow rue, you wouldn't be missing much in the way of flowers because they're just little and brown. And the Alpine salwort, I don't know if I've ever, I think I've once seen it in flower. Usually I pick it up by the leaves. These are in grazed places. So, but it can be such a rich flora in these, in that fairly nondescript looking vegetation. Okay, I think we're nearly at the end now. It's not far to go. Next picture, is just to show us how, yeah, grazing tends to reduce the dwarf shrub components, make it more graminoid dominated. In this case, deer grass. In other cases, it can be purple moorgrass as dominant. Burning has an effect as well. Obviously, patch burning, like this in this picture here, grouse moor management, is very obvious just seeing the patches, but also it has an effect on the vegetation, tended to homogenize things, reducing the overall floristic diversity over the years, which isn't a really good thing. And you can lose things like dwarf juniper and some species of mosses and liverworts as well. So yeah, it does leave its mark on the vegetation. Next picture is talking about a couple of questions. So if we imagine ourselves on a gentle slope on peat that's less than 50 centimeters deep, so shallow peat, and two possible scenarios: purple moorgrass dominant with just titchy bits of heather and cross-leaved heath. What kind of NBC type is that? And then again, the same thing except deer grass dominant with titchy bits of heather and cross-leaved heath. So what's in both of those cases, what do you think the NPMS type is? Somebody's saying, where did I find it? Yes, I do have a good reference and a date. I do indeed, yes. So we'll give a wee minutes for, oh, here we are. It was a very short minute. So purple moorgrass dominant, like we had quite early on, even with titchy little bits of heather, but so little. It's purple moorgrass vegetation, which comes out on the shallow peat, marsh and fen. Deer grass dominant, wet heath. So as I mentioned at the bottom, they're both in places where probably would have had more in the way of like the heather, certainly the heather, among the dwarf shrubs, but that would have been lost out a bit by grazing or burning or both. Okay, almost at the end. I said that a few slides ago, but negative indicators in wet heath, they're the same as the negative indicators in bogs. Young trees, although as I said for bogs in the presentation last week, sometimes some places young trees can be seen as a good thing, depending on what people's conservation objectives are. Actually, probably more in wet heath than in bogs, because a lot of bogs people don't really want them to get covered in trees. Thistles and nettles, not very common in wet heath at all, but where you do get them, there's probably been some kind of disturbance or nutrient enrichment. And those tall tufted rushes are negative indicators, and it's mainly Juncus diffusus that's going to be the one. If you're going to find a tall tufted rush, probably going to be that one, which can occur naturally in some of the wet heaths, especially where they're a bit flushed. But if they're a bit disturbed, trampled, that kind of thing, you're a bit more likely to find them. Could indicate that. And that's just about us, because the last page is saying here we are at the end, and hope it's been of interest. And this photo I took on the Isle of Skye not that long ago, when Alison and I were doing some surveys of mosses and liverworts and lichens in some area on the island. Interesting area. Somebody might say, oh, it's a bit drab and brown, but it's a pretty exciting place there, you know. Yeah.
I don't think I was going to say it looks drab and uninviting. That looks amazing. Exceptional view. Thank you ever so much, Ben. I can see that we are getting right towards the end. Oh, we're 1 minute. So that was beautifully timed as well. If anybody does have one or two very last minute questions for us to try and squeeze in, please do say now. Pop them in the chat box or the Q&A box. Alternatively, if you're anything like me, you won't think of anything now, and then you'll go away and think, oh, I wish I'd asked that. Always do that. I don't know about you. You can always pop us an email, and I can either answer myself or send an email over to Ben, more likely for his expert opinion, and we can get back to you. So yes, you can always get in touch with any questions as well. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining. As I say, this will be popped up on the YouTube channel in due course. Mostly people saying thank you very much. I haven't had any questions yet, so hopefully we've covered everything. And as I say, if you think of anything, do get in touch. Brilliant. So thank you ever so much, Ben.
Welcome.
That was lovely,
No,
and indeed
you.
a very nice,
Thank you.
relaxing lunchtime activity after all busy boarding of, as you say, emails and whatnot. So that was lovely.
Yeah. Have to get back to all that now.
Yes,
Oh,
now back to it, everyone. Right, brilliant. Thank you ever so much, everyone.
Okay, bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.